friends, welcome to Storytime. It has been so long since I've seen you, but all this hot weather has made me think that it would be really nice to have a story time inside. So I am so happy to be here with you today. My name is Miss Becca, if you haven't watched a story with me before, and I'm the owner of Becca's Book Box. So if you want really good ideas for books, you can follow me, or your mom and dad can. Today, we're gonna read The Raft by Jim LaMarche, and I love The Raft. You know I love so many books, but this is one of my favorite summertime stories. And I love this story so much because it really prioritizes being outside all summer. And I think that's such a good way to spend your summer. So we're gonna read The Raft. I want you to look at the front cover of books when you read them. And there's that old saying, you can never tell a book by its cover, and that is true. Sometimes a cover isn't as exciting as the inside of the book. But what I want you to look at the front cover is for clues about the story. So if we're looking at this front cover, what do we see? We see a boy, who we're gonna find out his name is Nicky. We see he's on a raft, like the title, and we see all these animals. So I'm already thinking in my mind, how are we gonna get to this? What's gonna happen in this story that there's gonna be a boy on a raft with some animals? Let's read to find out. The Raft by Jim LaMarche. Look at Nicky. You see him? I'm gonna fold it back and you can look at Nicky while I read this page to you. There's nobody to play with, I complained. She doesn't even have a TV. Who's she? I'm thinking. Dad grinned. Wow, she's not your normal kind of grandma, I guess, he said. Calls herself a river rat, he chuckled. But I promise she'll find plenty for you to do. And you know I can't take you with me this summer, Nicky. There will be no kids there, and I'll be spending all my time at the plant. I felt tears again, but I blinked hard and looked out the window. So I kind of love when a story just jumps right in, and this is jumping right in. You can tell Nicky is in the car with, who's he with? His dad. They're on the way to Grandma's. Does Nicky want to go to Grandma's for the summer? No, why not? She doesn't have a TV. It's boring. So we kind of already know how Nicky is feeling. Okay. That afternoon, I stood in Grandma's yard and watched my dad drive away. Dust rose up behind our car as it disappeared into the pines. Well, we can't stand here all summer, said Grandma. Come on, Nicky, it's time for supper. Grandma looks happy to have Nicky there, but I'm not so sure about how Nicky feels. Wow, look inside Grandma's house. Honey or maple syrup on your cornbread, Grandma asked. I don't like cornbread, I mumbled, poking my finger into the syrup pitcher when she wasn't looking. If you're going to do that, you'd better wash up first, she said. She had eyes in the back of her head. Bathrooms through there. I pushed the doorway curtain aside and walked into what would have been a living room in anyone else's house. Books were scattered everywhere. My kind of house. On the tables, on the chairs, even on the floor. 3 of the walls were cluttered with sketches and stuffed fish and charts of the river. Several fishing poles hung from the 4th with a tackle box, a snorkel, and a mask on the floor beneath them. It looked like a river rat's workroom, all right, except that in the middle of everything was a half-finished carving of a bear. Been carving that old fellow for years, Grandma called from the kitchen. The real one hangs out at the dump. Now come get your supper before I feed it to him. Would you like to be at this Grandma's house? I'm thinking I would. It seems like there's so much to discover. look at Nikki and I'll read the back pages to you. Dad was right. Grandma found plenty for me to do. In the morning, I stacked firewood, then helped her clean out the rain gutters and change the spark plugs on her truck. The afternoon was almost over when she handed me a cane pole, a bobber, and some red worms. Fish fry tonight, she said, showing me how to bait the hook. That river's full of fat bluegills. Drop your line near the lily pads and you'll find them. Down at the dock, I looked things over. The lily pads were too close to the shore. There couldn't be fish there. I walked to the end of the dock and threw my line out as far as I could. Then I sat and waited. And waited. And waited. My bobber never moved. There's no fish in this stupid river, I said out loud, disgusted. We had hamburgers for supper. What do you think of Nikki's attitude? He just is kind of acting like, what does his grandma know, right? And he's got a bad attitude. I'm gonna fold it back again so you can really see the picture, okay? What do you see Nikki doing? Give it another try, said Grandma the next evening. I bet you'll catch something. Don't count on it, I thought. As I headed back to the dock, I threw my line in the water. Then I stretched out on the dock to wait. I must have fallen asleep because I was awakened by loud chirping and chattering. I sat up and looked around. A flock of birds was moving toward me along the river, hovering over something floating on the water. It drifted downstream closer and closer until finally it bumped against the dock. What does it look like? Though it was covered with leaves and branches, now I could tell that it was a raft. What was it doing floating down the river all by itself, I wondered. I reached down and pushed some of the leaves aside. Beneath them was a drawing of a rabbit. It looked like those ancient cave paintings I'd seen in books. Just outlines, but wild and fast and free. How cool. I cleaned away more leaves. And it was like finding presents under the Christmas tree. A bear, a fox, a raccoon, all with the wild look of the rabbit. Who had drawn them, I wondered? Where had the raft come from? Where do you think the raft came from? We don't know yet, but now's a really good time to make a prediction. You should predict where you think the raft came from. Let's keep reading to find out. I ran up to the cottage. You see Nikki? Look at that cool raft. Grandma was on the porch reading. Do you have some rope I can use? I asked. In the shed, hun, she said. Help yourself. She didn't ask me what I needed it for, and I decided not to tell her yet. Are you hearing how Nikki's attitude is changing a little bit? I pushed the raft into the reeds along the river's edge, then tied it to the dock so it wouldn't drift away. All the while, birds flew over my head every now and then, swooping down to the raft. As if it were a friend, a crane waded through the reeds to find it. A turtle swam up from the bottom of the river. The moon had risen yellow over the river by the time I went up to the cottage to bed. What do you think Nikki's thinking now? Look how cool. Do you think he expected to find that at his grandma's house? I'm thinking he wasn't. What are they doing? I love the pictures in this book. If you can get it from the library, or maybe if you can convince someone to get it for you, the pictures in this book are so cool. I was already down at the dock the next morning when Grandma appeared with a life jacket and a long pole. She didn't seem surprised by the raft at all, or by the animal pictures all over it. How did you know? I started. Let's go, Grandma interrupted, tossing me the life jacket and stepping onto the raft. She pushed the pole hard into the river bottom and we moved smoothly into the current. Your turn, she said after a few minutes. She showed me how to hold the pole and push, and I pulled us up to the middle of the river. Even there, the water wasn't over my head. We pulled the raft up the river, then let it slowly drift back down. The birds kept us company the whole time, soaring, swooping, singing. Some even landed on the raft and rode with us for a while. Hitchhikers, Grandma called them. Do you know what a hitchhiker is? Sometimes people will wait on the side of the road in hopes of getting a ride from someone else, and those are called hitchhikers. So Grandma's calling the birds hitchhikers because they're catching a ride down the river. How does Nicky sound now? I think he sounds very different from the beginning of the book. What do you think? How has his voice and his tone changed? After that, I had little time for anything but the raft. Here, I cut off Nicky there. Can you see him? I raced through whatever chores there were, then ran down to the dock, wondering what animals I would see that day. It wasn't just birds that the raft attracted. One morning, 3 raccoons followed me along the shore. Another time, a turtle climbed on board and spent the morning sunning itself. And one afternoon, I saw a family of foxes slip through the trees along the river. When the weather turned too hot and sticky to sleep indoors, Grandma helped me put a small tent on the raft. Look how cool that looks. I lay on top of the cool sheets and read comics by flashlight until I fell asleep. One night, a noise woke me up. There in the moonlight stood a huge buck. He looked right at me. Then lowered his head to drink as if it wasn't there, as if I weren't there at all. I found Grandma the next morning working on her bear carving. Do you have some extra paper I could draw on? I asked. She brought out a big sketch pad and pouch filled with thick pencils and crayons. I've been saving these for you, she said. Better take these too. She held out a snorkel and a mask. Never know when they might come in handy on a raft. It's almost as if Grandma just knew. She was like waiting for Nicky to discover the raft. And then she just knew what he wanted next. Sometimes grandmas are like that, aren't they? Oh, look how cool. The sun was hot that afternoon, so I pulled into the shade of a willow, then waited to see what animals the raft would bring. It wasn't long before a great blue heron whooshed down with the crayfish in its bill. I grabbed a pencil and began to sketch. I felt invisible as the bird calmly ate its lunch right in front of me. Then I preened its feathers, looked back up the river, and flew off. That night I showed my drawing to Grandma. Not bad, she said, not bad at all. And she tacked it up to the wall on top of one of her own sketches. How do you think that made Nicky feel? If I were Nicky and I worked on a sketch and my grandma put it right up in her house, I would feel so proud. I would feel really good about myself. Oh, look at this. That's why I love this story. Look at, what is Nicky doing? Can you see him? One day, I pulled up the river farther than I'd ever been, near a clump of tall cattails. I startled an otter family. They dove under the water. But as with the other animals, the raft seemed to calm them down. Soon, they were playing all around me. Grandma had been right about the mask and snorkel coming in handy. I slipped them on, then hung my head over the raft and watched the otters play, chasing fish, chasing each other, sometimes just chasing their own tails. I kept very still, but they didn't seem to mind me watching. They played keep away with a small stone, then tug of war with a piece of rope. It was like they were showing off for me. They even let me feed them right out of my hand. Some mornings, Grandma would make a bag full of sandwiches and a thermos of icy lemonade. Then we'd put on our bathing suits, grab some towels, a lawn chair, and an inner tube, and pull upriver to her favorite swimming spot. That Grandma looks fun, doesn't she? I've come swimming here since I was a girl, she told me when we tied the raft to the old dock. The Marshalls used to live here. All 10 of them. What a herd of wild animals they were. While Grandma watched me from the inner tube, I practiced my flying cannonballs. Then we'd eat our lunch and she'd tell me stories about growing up on the river. My favorite was of the time she'd found a small black pearl inside a river clam. I still have it, she said. I'm thinking about when we started this book, and Nicky was talking about how his grandma's was so boring. There was no TV, no friends. I wonder if you asked Nicky now what he thought of grandma's, what he would say. Somehow on the river, it seemed like summer would never end. But of course it did. On my last day, I got up extra early and crept down to the dock. The air was cool and a low, pearly fog hung over the river. I untied the raft and quietly drifted downstream. Ahead of me through the fog, I saw 2 deer moving across the river, a doe and her fawn. When they reached the shore, the doe leaped easily up the steep bank, then turned to wait for her baby. But the fawn was in trouble. It kept sliding into the muddy bank. The doe returned to the water to help. But the more the fawn struggled, the deeper it got stuck in the mud. Aw, look at Nicky. I pushed off the river bottom and drove the raft hard into the muddy bank, startling the doe. Then I dropped into the water. I was ankle deep in mud. You're okay, I whispered to the fawn, praying that the raft would calm it. I won't hurt you. Gradually, the fawn stopped struggling, as if it understood that I was there to help. I put my arms around it and pulled. It barely moved. I pulled again, then again. Slowly, the fawn eased out of the mud, and finally, it was free. Carefully, I carried the fawn up the bank to its mother. Then, quietly, I returned to the raft. From there, I watched the doe nuzzle and clean her baby, and I knew what I had to do. I pulled the stub of crayon from my pocket and drew the fawn in all its wildness onto the old gray boards of the raft. When I had finished, I knew it was just right. After supper, I showed Grandma my drawing of the fawn, and I told her my story. It's perfect, she said, but we need to do one more thing. She hurried up to the cottage. When she came back, she had tubes of oil paint and 2 brushes. Grandma helped me trace my drawing with the oil paint, which soaked deep into the wood. That'll keep it, she said. Now you'll always be part of the river. Just like you, Grandma, a river rat. Grandma laughed. Just like me, she agreed. The end. What a good story. I think Jim LaMarche does such a fabulous job of telling this story, but his pictures really make the story come alive. But why I read this story to you today is because, as you know, I love this book. But also, this summer might not be quite what you thought it would be. We can't do all the things that we usually do in the summer. But Nikki still made the most of it. And so what I want you to do this summer is I want you to make the most of it and get outside. So until next time, happy reading and have a good summer.